Shelly here, and it is time for another review in 5, where I take a look at a new product, give you my thoughts in 5 minutes or so. And today I'm going to take a look at a new release from Wet n Wild. This is one of their new 10-pan eyeshadows, and it is the one called Rose in the Air. It is also the one that is potentially a dupe for this guy. Now I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm sitting all at a crazy angle. The great thing about this new setup, the way I've got the window light shining in here, is that the natural light makes everything look so much better, but I also have to contend with direct sunlight at this time of the day. So I'm going to try to avoid getting too much direct sunlight all over me and driving you guys crazy with that, but I apologize in advance because the sun is always moving and, well, actually the earth is always moving. But let's take a look at this eyeshadow palette. First up, I've got swatches side by side of these two eyeshadows. So the first swatch is the Wet n Wild, and the second swatch is the Modern Renaissance. Let's take a look and see how these compare. Here are some swatches of the shades that are in the Wet n Wild palette. I have first swatched the Wet n Wild, and then next to it I've swatched the equivalent from the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. So first up we have Tempera, just about an even match. I think the Wet n Wild might be a touch warmer. Second is Buonfresco, and they are very, very close. Third up is Antique Bronze. I think the bronze in the ABH palette is a little bit more true bronze, a little bit cooler toned, and a bit more of a nice opaque satin finish. Then we've got Love Letter, and the ABH version is just a little bit more berry toned, but they're very close. Cypress Umber is almost dead on. The ABH is slightly more pigmented, but they are the same brown, the same kind of undertone. Very beautiful. In the bottom row, we've got Raw Sienna, and the Wet n Wild version is just a little bit darker and leaning just a little more orange. Then there's Primavera, and again, the Wet n Wild version leans just a little bit more orange. Then we've got Red Ochre. The Wet n Wild version has a little bit less brown in it. It's a little bit more closer to a true red, but they're both a brown-based red. Then we've got Warm Taupe, and they're nearly identical. And last is Real Gar, and the ABH version has just a little bit more depth to it. It's a little bit deeper, but they're the same sort of orange-brown undertone and very similar in color. So in order to test these out, I decided to apply them straight on my eyes and do the same eye look on both sides using the exact same brushes and switching colors in between with a color switch sponge, and just to see how they compare. Now, let me show you guys what we came up with, and you tell me, can you tell which is which? I think they look pretty doggone similar. So let's go through how I put this eye look together. I started out by priming my lids with the MAC Paint Pot in Painterly, and then I set that with the Wet n Wild Single in Creme Brulee. They do have a new version of this out, as they've reformulated their singles as well. Then I used a fluffy blending brush, and I'm going to call these colors by their Modern Renaissance names, since the Wet n Wild don't have shade names, they have shade numbers. So I used the ABH color Raw Sienna, and the equivalent to that is the number 10 transition shade in the Wet n Wild palette. I use this as my transition in and slightly above the crease. Then I went in with Red Ochre from the ABH palette. The equivalent in the Wet n Wild side is shade number 7, and use this on the outer third of my lid. Next, I darkened up the outer corner with the ABH Cypress Umber. The equivalent in the Wet n Wild palette is number 5. And one of the problems I had with the Wet n Wild is that this color, it's not as pigmented as the ABH, and it just sort of wanted to blend away. Now for my lid, my absolute favorite color in the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette is Vermeer. And there is no dupe for Vermeer in the Wet n Wild palette. So I used Primavera, which does have a Wet n Wild dupe. The Primavera dupe is shade number 3 in the Wet n Wild palette. And used that all over my lid. And I went back in with Cypress Umber or shade number 9 to darken up the crease. For inner corner highlight, Vermeer, I'm sorry, I cheated. I put Vermeer from the ABH palette on both sides of my face on the inner corner because it is just one of my favorite inner corner colors of all times. This sun is going to drive me absolutely nuts. For my lower lash line, I first blended out raw sienna, and then I went back in with the Cypress Umber in the outer third or so of my lower lash line. So what do you think? Do you think we have a dupe on our hands? I think we have a dupe on our hands. This is a $5 eyeshadow palette. You know that the drugstore has sales all the time and you can get it much less expensively. Overall, I feel like the colors are very similar. So if you do enjoy the color scheme of the Modern Renaissance palette but don't want to spend that much money, go get yourself this new Wet n Wild palette. The pigmentation is a little less intense on the Wet n Wild. Blendability is very similar, although, you know, very few things are going to beat the Modern Renaissance palette in the gorgeous blendability that it's got. But this one is really totally usable, totally blendable. I think that it's really close. It's a really, really close dupe. It is missing my favorite shade, and the dark shades don't have quite as much pigmentation or quite as much staying power as the Modern Renaissance, but I'm gonna call it a dupe, so there you have it. My comparison of the new Wet n Wild Rose in the Air to the beloved Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. If you would like to see more of these quick review style videos or more comparisons of affordable products versus high-end, give me a thumbs up down below. If you have suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for taking some time out of your day to geek out over makeup with me. I appreciate it, and I hope you guys all have an awesome day or night wherever you are in the world. Take care of each other. Bye-bye.